94.9. It is 4:15 and we have Dr. Mark Harwood on the line from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon, Dr. Mark.
Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be with you today.
It's great to have you back on again. And of course, for those of you who might remember, we had Dr. Mark Harwood on Creation Ministries International's sort of time slot a couple of months ago. Dr. Mark is he's a scientist. He's pretty much a rocket scientist. Is that the easiest way to say it, Dr. Mark?
Well, I usually describe myself as a spacecraft engineer. That might be a better phrase.
I don't know. Rocket scientist sounds really, really cool.
Well, you're right. It does sound better, doesn't it?
And of course, you were looking after the Optus spacecraft. And look, you know, if there's anyone out there that knows anything about aliens, well, you'd be the man. If they were out there, you would have seen them, I reckon.
Yeah. Oh, that's another topic.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Dr. Mark Harwood, we had a great chat with you last time, and this time I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, a little bit about your earlier years. Can you tell us about your stepping out for Jesus? When did it go through your mind, okay, I'm going to step out for this guy because he sounds fair dinkum?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually had the privilege of growing up in a Christian home, Nick, but I didn't actually take a personal commitment until a Billy Graham crusade. That was back in 1959 in Adelaide. Mm-hmm. Billy Graham did all the capital cities of Australia in 59. I lived in Adelaide at the time, and I was just 10 years old. So your listeners can now figure out how old I am. But I can remember it as clear as though it were yesterday. I was sitting up there in that massive grandstand. It was just packed full of people, and the choir is singing Just As I Am. Billy Graham's making the invitation for people to come forward, and through my mind are running these words, "You're not good enough." And even at 10 years old, I knew, well, you know what, I know I'm not good enough. I can't go down. And I sat rooted at the spot. I wanted to go, but I couldn't do it because I'm not good enough. And this went on, and finally Billy Graham came right to the end. He gets the final call, and I just said to myself, you know what, I don't care if I'm not good enough, I'm going anyway. And I got up and went down. I was met by a counsellor, led to a little group, and that really started, I think, my personal journey in relationship with the Lord. Of course, I now realise that, you're absolutely right. Of course, I wasn't good enough. Nobody is. But it was a trick, I think, of the enemy to try and prevent me from making that commitment. Of course, only Jesus is good enough, but we put our confidence in him, not in our own efforts and work. And that's the beauty of the Christian gospel message.
Now, of course, you ended up going through university. You would have been one of the extremely smart students when you got to the end of your HSC to have done what you've done. I've heard that a lot of people that go into university, particularly at your level, they get battered out of Christianity.
Yes, that's very sad, but unfortunately very true. I actually didn't do the HSC. I was in the old Wyndham scheme. Sorry, before the Wyndham scheme, the old leaving certificate scheme.
Wow.
In South Wales. I was the last of that year. So I left high school in 1965, and the students the year behind me went on and didn't leave high school until 67. They did 6 years of high school and I did 5. So I went into university not particularly confidently, I've got to say. I was... pretty keen on wanting just to pass and survive. But the further I went through university, I think the more I enjoyed it and the more I really took to the science and engineering subjects. And I ended up doing an honours degree and then got a postgraduate scholarship and did a doctoral degree there at Sydney University. But, in subjects like engineering is all about how the universe works, how things go. It's about observable experiments, actually making measurements, designing things. So what you believe about where you came from and how you got here actually doesn't figure in the course material. Where it does is when people study things like biology and geology and so on, and the more general science subjects. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, when the Wyndham scheme came in, there was a significant change following it. And it was years later I discovered this. I can remember in Adelaide, a couple of years before that Billy Graham crusade, the Russians launched a satellite called Sputnik. It was the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. And my father took me outside after dark, and we stood in the front and looked up, and we could see this little dot of light moving quite quickly across the sky. And he was telling me about the satellite Sputnik. Now, that sent shockwaves through the West because it was suddenly apparent that the Russians were technologically more advanced. And so the West ratcheted up the teaching of science in the schools and universities, and that was one of the motivations in the preparation of the Wyndham Scheme curriculum, because that is when evolution began to be taught in high schools. So after the late 50s, we moved here to Sydney. That's why I was in the New South Wales system at that stage. But it was in the Wyndham Scheme where evolution started to be pushed. And, it's really, really interesting. In the following years, if you look at statistics on things like property crime, youth male suicides, and those sorts of things, you find quite a steep increase. And I know there are all sorts of complex factors that contribute to those things, but one of the things is that the Wyndham Scheme and the theory of evolution was teaching young kids that they were the result of just cosmic random processes over millions of years. And the fine print, if you like, is there's no God. And so they started to lose a sense of their uniqueness, their specialness of being made in God's image and so on. And a direct consequence of that are all these kinds of social difficulties that arise. And it's really interesting to see the statistics of that. So when I was at university, I just enjoyed learning how the universe works and how to apply it in my engineering subjects. And but there was a survey done just a couple of years ago now by the Barnard Group. They do a lot of surveys of church communities around the world. This was a global survey of the millennials, which are the 18 to 35-year-old age group. And one of the questions they asked was, what things make you or block your interest in the spiritual dimensions? And the number one issue in Australia and New Zealand, and number two globally, was science. And, it's amazing. Now, that's not the science of the laboratory where you measure things like the temperature at which water boils, but it's the science that tells you evolution's a fact and we're just cosmic accidents and, hey, that's code for there is no God.
Yeah.
So isn't that amazing? That was the number one issue that blocks young people from having an interest in spiritual things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yeah, I totally understand how people would lose hope when they're told that they're just an accident. You're just all an accident of, something sort of going bang. Yeah. And we've actually had a question come in that relates to the Big Bang. So we might go into a song right now, and you have Dr. Mark Harwood on the line. Dr. Mark Harwood, who is, I've got to call him basically a rocket scientist. And Dr. Mark, someone's been waiting for you to come back by the looks of it. I've got a question. Hi, Dr. Mark. Welcome back, sir. I've been hoping you'd be back on as I've pondered the following for some months now. Since NASA has started releasing images taken from the James Webb Telescope, there's been a big debate amongst cosmologists. I've got to say those images that I've looked at are amazing. That the Big Bang Theory is finished, kaput. Can you tell us, what have they seen from 1.5 million kilometres out from us that's different from what they've seen from Earth and from the Hubble Space Telescope? And finally, how does what has been seen debunk the Big Bang Theory?
Wow, okay. We probably won't be able to fit all of that in the next little gap, but I'll start. So is the Big Bang kaput? Well, probably not. There have been a tremendous amount of evidence over the years that has shown the Big Bang to be really quite bankrupt as a theory. But every single time new evidence comes up, they come up with some kind of a rescue package that salvages it. So I don't think we're going to see the Big Bang abandoned anytime soon. But what they're seeing that is different is that this telescope is able to penetrate far further away into the universe than optical telescopes can. And because it works in the infrared region, and that enables them to see a lot further out. And cosmologists interpret that as meaning closer to the time when the Big Bang actually occurred. And according to the Big Bang theory, you should start off with infant galaxies and things. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a few moments when we come back afterwards.
All right, 94.9 this afternoon. It's 23 minutes to 5. And we have Dr. Mark Harwood on the line from Creation Ministries International. Dr. Mark Harwood, who was pretty much a rocket scientist, and no better man to answer this particular question that Bob sent in. Thank you, Bob. In regards to the photos that NASA has been releasing from James Webb Telescope. And, of course, he asked the questions, what have they seen from 1.5 million kilometres out that is different from what they've seen from Earth or from the Hubble telescope? And finally, how does what's been seen debunk the Big Bang Theory?
Right. Well, as I said before, a great question. What the James Webb Telescope does, because it works in the infrared band and not just the ordinary optical one, permits the telescope to see further and further out into the universe than optical telescopes can. And so I guess that's what's different. But what is really causing a stir is that the images that are coming back are not what the Big Bang advocates predicted would be seen. So the idea of the Big Bang is that immediately after the Big Bang, or short time later, after stars and so on form up, they gather together in generally kind of amorphous blobs, just non-structured kind of galaxies, and over time these galaxies acquire more and more structure. So closer ones to us we see have things like spiral galaxies and barred galaxies and all kinds of particular shapes that indicate a lot of structure. So it was expected that the very early galaxies would just be blobs and without any structure. In fact, one of the scientists wrote before the launch, he said, Webb's unprecedented infrared sensitivity will help astronomers to compare the faintest, earliest galaxies to today's grand spirals and ellipticals, helping us to understand how galaxies assemble over billions of years. But what's come back is that these distant galaxies show maturity, all the structure and spiral galaxies, barred galaxies, ring galaxies, all sorts of things that were not expected to be seen. And so this just is throwing a real spanner in the theoreticians' works, as it were. So now they're having to scramble to say, well, actually, we got that wrong. So it looks like the predictions that we made from the Big Bang aren't correct. So obviously there's some mechanism by which early galaxies acquire a great deal of structure and look mature very, very quickly. And now we have to find what that mechanism is. So you notice at no stage do they say, oh dear, we'll have to abandon the Big Bang. And the reason they won't abandon the Big Bang is that there's actually nothing else as a viable theoretical secular alternative. Apart from saying, well, gee, maybe the universe was created by God. Well, you just can't go there. In our culture, that's seen as just a blind religious position that has no scientific or intellectual support. Of course, the reverse is actually true. So when you look at something which is highly structured and designed, which is what we see in the universe, and then consistently maintain, oh, it's not designed, it's just an accident, I think that actually is more of an intellectual faith leap than believing that God created it. So that's what they're seeing that is different. And it doesn't debunk the Big Bang. I mean, from my point of view, I would say it's another massive problem which cannot be answered by the Big Bang. But for the Big Bangers, they will spin it. They'll find some kind of a rescue explanation. And they've done this all along. You know, we've got dark matter and dark energy, for instance, which only exist to preserve the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Which is really quite fascinating. So if you don't have dark matter and dark energy, then the Big Bang fails to explain what we observe in the universe. So what I used to learn when I was doing science at university was if the predictions of a theory don't work, then you need to go and change the theory or abandon the theory. But what's happening is they say, well, we've got the theory and we know that has to be right because there's nothing else, We've got the observations, so therefore we have to invent things that make the theory work. And that's where dark energy and dark matter come from.
Has anyone actually ever seen dark energy or dark matter? Is there any actual proof of? Okay, so it's only a theory.
No, none at all. None at all. They've been conducting experiments costing millions of dollars for decades now, and they've come up with absolutely zero. They cannot detect it. That's why they call it dark, because it can't be seen, can't be detected. But that's not science. Science is about observational things, and if you can't observe something, that says to me it's probably outside of science. But, Mick, I think what this really shows is how religious the Big Bang actually is. It's an article of faith, and without it, your only option is to say, well, the universe must have been created. And people don't want to go down that path, because if there's a creator God, then, wow, maybe I'll be held accountable for how I've lived my life. And I don't want to be accountable to anybody other than myself. And so people reject the idea of a creator God, even though all the evidence that we see in all the disciplines of science, in fact, are like signposts that all point to the reality of a creator God.
I've got to say, with a very... Sorry?
I was just going to say, for that reason, I really love science, because every day, there's new evidence that points to the reality of the existence of God, but also the truth of his word, the Bible.
Yes, absolutely. With a very small mind like mine, I mean, I go out into the night sky. I love it when I'm in places like the Snowy Mountains. There's not a lot of light around, and you can just see the stars and how magnificent they are. But you can also see the blackness between the stars. And you sort of think, wow, what's out beyond that? And then, of course, Hubble telescope showed us, some of those amazing spiral galaxies and stuff. And you think, okay, so there's that stuff out there. But then beyond that is just blackness. And you imagine a Big Bang. I mean, I'm just putting it together in my own mind, very simply. Imagine a Big Bang. I've seen explosions before. It goes bang, there's a centre, there's probably more in the middle, there's a lot less out around the outside. So you imagine that, further and further out you go, there'll be less and less stars. Pretty much, that's just how it works in my mind. But now, this new James Webb telescope has shown these spiral galaxies that are like, thousands of light years away, and behind them are billions more stars. And you sort of think, well,
that's right.
Totally blew my thought out the door. If there was ever a Big Bang, it just doesn't look like it. It's it just right. What we can see doesn't fit together.
But even what we can see, I think, is testified by the psalmist in Psalm 19, where he said, "The heavens declare the glory of God." And they really do. I know exactly what you mean. I've had occasionally, when I get out of Sydney, we get out to the countryside on a moonless, clear night. The stars are absolutely breathtaking.
Yes,
I never tire of it. The glory of God is surely revealed in the heavens.
Yes. I just love looking up and seeing them all. There's just it's some of those images, just they blow my mind. That I've seen some awesome artworks, but just looking at those stars, you think that is beyond an artwork. And how is it so precise? The way that it forms these nebulas and things. It's like these are stars that even inside the nebula, they're a long way apart.
Yeah.
And you just think, man, that's just so beyond what any of us can even think of, yet someone's trying to come up with a theory for it regardless.
That's right. They want a theory that can explain it all without God, which, is a really interesting point, and something that I didn't understand for a long time. But evolution is really an attempt to explain the universe without God. And by the way, evolution doesn't just relate to biological evolution. It relates to cosmic evolution, geological evolution, and so on, as well as biological and human evolution. So it's really an attempt to do away with God, or if you like, I think you could safely say evolution is like atheism dressed up in a lab coat.
Yeah.
So it comes with all the authority of science, but when you peel away the surface, you discover it's simply a religious belief that there is no God. And, when I suddenly realised, well, gosh, evolution is it's a religion and it's atheism.
Yep.
It made all the difference. So the reason there is so much apparent conflict between the Bible's account of creation and the evolutionary story is that it's a conflict between two different belief systems. And one belief starts by assuming there is no God and attempts to explain the entire universe based on that assumption. The other begins with the assumption that there is a God, and in particular the God who's revealed himself in the Bible. And based on that, we have a means by which we can explore and examine and understand the physical universe that we live in. And when you've got two radically different starting points like that, it's no wonder that the conflict occurs between so-called science and Christianity or religion. But it's not true that creationists are anti-science, because the kind of science that I worked in, designing and building communication spacecraft, is what you could call experimental science. And that's all based on making observations and measurements. And you can do that whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, or whatever. You make measurements in a laboratory or in a workshop, and from that you can make logical deductions. And that's the kind of science which gives us all these amazing technologies that we take for granted, like computers and mobile phones, and the fact that we can talk like this and be broadcast over the airwaves into the Central Coast. All of that technology comes from experimental science. There's never, ever any conflict between experimental science and the historical record of the Bible. It's only in that area of historical science where people tell stories about the past. So it's a religious conflict, not a scientific one.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask, Dr. Mark, will you be back next week?
I will indeed, and I'm looking forward to it, so we can continue to drill into this fascinating topic.
Absolutely. Oh, that'll be awesome. Well, I thank you so much again. It's great to have you back on, and very much